So let's talk about the strongest and weakest warriors of the glittering war hosts. Let's talk shurikens, plasma fire, and aspects of Cain, with a tier list for the Craftworld Eldar. Hello and welcome back to Auspex Tactics, the strategy-focused 40k channel, where today we're talking Craftworlds once more, where I thought we'd run through all the Aeldari units in the recent Eldar Codex. Overall, as with most 9th edition codexes, Codex Craftworlds really has amped up the Eldar army in every way, to the extent where I think that virtually every unit is at least somewhat usable, though as ever I feel that some are stronger than others, and some options are going to be overshadowed compared with the very best of the Codex. It's still fairly early days for the book. We haven't really seen all that much data from tournaments, and I think people are still going to be getting to grips with it, and perhaps puzzling out which combos are better than others. Still though, I thought today we'd run through which units I feel are going to be strongest in the book and why. We'll go through each Craftworld unit in turn, where I've chosen to rank them, and why I've placed them as I have. As always, if you feel like I've underestimated anything, or you think anything should be higher or lower than it is, let me know down in the comments. For this video, we are going to be focusing on just the Craftworld units, primarily the ones that can be taken by any Craftworld unit. I'm not going to be touching on the Harlequins or Aeldari in this list, though just as a general rule of thumb, pretty much everything in the Harlequins army is really very strong. I suspect we'll see quite a lot of Craftworld lists, with a decent chunk of Harlequins being allied. In any case, let's keep the focus on the Craftworlders though, and we'll go into tier 3, perhaps some of the weaker units in the army. So first up, the units that I've ranked down here, I still think are all generally quite usable, but are just in general going to be a bit overshadowed compared with their peers, and I think are going to be taken at least fairly rarely in the top most competitive armies. With the amount of synergies and stacking buffs that you can make happen in the Eldar Codex though, I still think the vast majority of units are really quite reasonable. I'm afraid since making these slides though, I have kind of changed my opinions on a couple of these guys. Both Illic Nightspear and the War Walkers I believe should be in tier 2. We'll talk about them when we get to them. First up, and perhaps one of the chiefest amongst the underwhelming units in the Codex, are unfortunately the Corsair Void Reavers. I think they perhaps might be arguably one of the weakest troops choices in the Codex. The Eldar Corsairs that don't get a Craftworld attribute, they're equipped with shuriken rifles, though they can take a few more punchy, hard-hitting anti-tank weapons. They feel like they're perhaps one of the units that's just going to be most widely eclipsed by any of the other options. They don't fill mandatory troop slots, so they don't help meet your detachment requirements. They don't have core, so they're not going to be particularly good for buffs, and as damage and defense go, they aren't terrible, though they're nothing really outstanding whatsoever. I guess they do have the advantage of being relatively cheap in their minimum unit size, and they do have objectives secured, which could make them quite handy for doing certain things like actions, I guess. I think in general though, most people are going to take rangers instead of them. They're not really all that many points more, and they bring some seriously nice advantages, mainly being able to forward deploy for not all that many more points. I think not filling their mandatory troop slots though really is a big deal, otherwise they'd be played a fair bit more. Next up we have Dark Reapers, a bit of a tricky unit really, as in theory they should be one of the units that should be best suited to receiving buffs, as they're an aspect warrior with decent range damage that can afford to stay a long way away. But in terms of damage dealing, they just feel like one of the more underwhelming aspects right now. Unless you upgrade them, they can't move and shoot for no penalty. They're very fragile for the points cost if they're ever exposed. The squad size locks to an annoying mid-sized number, so you can't either take huge squads for big buffs or cheap multiple small units. And after all that, their damage output I'd say is okay, though not enormously standout. Definitely still a unit that you can build around. They will do well with things like Guide and Fire and Fade, but I'm just not sure that they're the go-to Eldar damage dealers anymore. Wraith Knights have been vastly improved. They've got a -1 damage and a 5+ invul save, both of which are really useful for super heavy walkers. Though despite having some fairly impressive numbers on their big guns, I still don't think that their damage output is massively outstanding. Certainly a vast improvement on what they were before, but being a Lord of War really gives you quite a lot of downsides. It makes it difficult to get a Craftworld attribute, it costs you CP, and you'll interact badly with terrain, and compared with other units you just need to be really outstanding to make that work, and I don't think the Wraith Knight is really quite that far ahead of its peers. Next up we have the Eldar Plains, the Crimson Hunter and the Hemlock Wraith Fighter. Again, maybe an example of damage dealers that just don't quite compare quite well enough to the other options in the Codex. The Crimson Hunter puts out some decent anti-tank fire, and of course it gets around the battlefield phenomenally fast, getting line of sights on what it needs to. The Hemlock's damage output I'm not quite as excited about with those D-scythes, but being able to zoom over to the other side of the board and lay down something like Jinx certainly does have its big advantages. I'd say maybe the main issue with these guys is they're really quite expensive for how easy they are to take down. They won't really help out with objectives, and they just don't hit quite hard enough for how fragile they are. Still by no means bad, but I'd be more tempted by other things. Next up we have Illic Nightspear, who to be fair I maybe could have put in tier 2. As sniper characters go, he isn't really all that bad, but snipers just really do have their downsides in 9th edition. If you care that much about sniper damage, you can often just hide behind terrain or park your characters next to a bodyguard unit, which are pretty popular in top lists. Still though, I think he probably should have been a tier 2 character. If you do make him your warlord and also invest a Strands of Fate dice for the wound roll, then he does put out some reliable sniper fire. If you punch in that automatic 6 to wound, he's going to be getting D3 plus 1 mortal wounds on the target, plus if they fail their armor save, then they'll be taking 3 more. I guess for his points cost, having that kind of threat about isn't too bad. He can't be shot very easily when they're far away from the enemy. I think perhaps his biggest downside is being locked to a Laytok, which I don't think is going to be the most played Craftworld. Overall though, I think it was probably a mistake to put him down in tier 3. With a little investment, he can be a potent sniper. Similarly for Warwalkers, I do feel that they should be out in tier 2, reasonable gun platforms, and we'll talk about them later. Next up we have Fire Dragons, one of the units that has some seriously exciting stats on paper, but despite that is maybe still just a little bit expensive for frontline duties. For 23 points you do get a very tasty strength 9 damage d6 plus 2 fusion gun. Don't get me wrong, they do hit very hard against tanks, and if they can get a couple of volleys off against tanks, they should be able to make their points back. The issue is, I think when they've come in, that they're very rarely going to get the chance to strike a second time. Even with toughness 4 and a 3 plus armor save, they're really quite fragile for 23 points, and you're going to be wanting to put them right on the front lines, as otherwise their guns aren't going to be in range. They're also not a very general purpose threat either. Only a few shots will fry a couple of infantry, but if they don't have a hard target to get their hands on, then that crazy high damage profile is going to be completely wasted. I think maybe you could justify a small unit popping out of a webway gate, a falcon, or strategic reserve perhaps, but I definitely wouldn't be looking to overinvest in them. Next up we have the Shroud Runners, 35 point fast attack jet bikes with a ranger rifle and a scatter laser. As jet bikes they're very fast, and they do have a fair few fun special rules, coordinating with rangers or being able to get cover despite being bikes. Unfortunately, compared with things like Wind Riders or Vipers, they just don't really compare very well. For 35 points they're still really quite fragile for the cost. Maybe you could justify a unit for utility purposes, but when there's just so many other jet bikes that hit far harder than them, I think that they're going to get overlooked. Next up we have the Storm Guardians, perhaps the other most underwhelming unit in the Eldar troops choice. I think they do have a niche, which is if you do want to commit to a big squad of 10 of them for 80 points, then it does make them perhaps the most durable troops choice per point if you did just want to put lots of bodies down on an objective and not worry about damage output. I think their main problems are their competitors in the slot. If you're taking Guardians, I'd just be so much more tempted to take Guardian Defenders for the extra 1 point. Their Shuriken catapults are actually genuinely very dangerous, just worlds apart from the AP-1 melee attacks that these guys get. Strength 3 and AP-1 just isn't going to be enough to justify them against the vast majority of targets they might want to attack. Otherwise, if you just want cheap troops to hold objectives, you're going to be hard pressed to ignore the Rangers. Their base squad size is cheaper, and they can actually lend a hand with a bit of sniper damage from long range, and these guys won't be doing that. If all you want is just cheap, very slightly durable bodies, then they aren't that terrible, but I prefer Guardian Defenders myself. Finally, for tier 3 units, we have the Wraith Guard, who I perhaps feel are maybe in a bit of an annoying place as an elite unit. Their defense isn't too bad, their damage output isn't too bad, but I feel they're just maybe a little bit awkward in the place of being a big investment elite unit that wants to be close to the front line, but doesn't actually really want to be tied up in melee that much, even if they do have that new war construct rule to allow them to fire when they're in there. Overall, I still think that the Wraith Blades are going to get played quite a bit more. They just seem like an easier unit to use, soup them up with a whole load of melee and defensive buffs, and just charge them where they need to be. Moving on, we come to tier 2. These are the units that I'd rate as decently strong, all of them very usable in good Eldar lists, though maybe not at the absolute apex of the Codex, the units that I think are strongest and scariest. First up we have the Wraith Lord. I think big shooty and fighty units with core are always going to be interesting, and having a couple of these with a Ghost Glaive plus a couple of heavy weapons, maybe shuriken cannons or bright lancers, and stomping them up the board as a durable threat for the opponent to deal with, I think could be a worse idea. Quite nice that they can get a whole load of boosts from spells or auras and things due to having core. Perhaps their main weaknesses are just being a little bit slow to get into the fight, and despite having -1 damage, still might melt fairly easily to the very high damage 9th edition anti-tank weapons that are about. For the Avatar of Cain, it's an absolutely enormous melee threat and very tough for 270 points. Basically in a direct 1 versus 1 fight against the vast majority of monsters in 40k, he's got a good chance of coming out on top. I'd say probably his biggest issue is that he's just a little bit monodimensional. He doesn't offer a whole load of useful buffs for the army, and just stomps towards the enemy to engage them in combat. Being a ground-bound monster, he does have at least some capacity for being screen or move blocked, or just the enemy falling back a little bit from him to keep out of range until they actually want to have to deal with him. Still though, I think having an avatar on the board is almost certainly going to cause some problems. I feel like he could be a bit of a distraction Carnifex for the Eldar, hopefully something that the opponent really has to adjust their battle plans to accommodate, and hopefully allow the rest of your units to get to work a lot more effectively. Next we have the Eldar Fortification, the Webway Gate, basically an indestructible bit of battlefield terrain, which potentially allows you to bring Eldar units out of strategic reserve straight into the midfield. For 80 points, I think it's not a bad investment. I think perhaps the main issue with it is whether or not you're actually going to be able to set it up on certain boards. Depending on how much terrain that you're bringing along, you might find it hard to set it up outside 3 inches of every bit of other terrain there. It also doesn't add any direct damage or defense to your army, which might not help too much, but theoretically it can be really quite scary. If you can put it down somewhere that's close to an objective, then you could potentially deliver lethal Eldar Aspect Warriors straight to the fight, hopefully allowing them to get the alpha strike on any enemy units that happen to be trying to take down the points. Next up we have Viper Jet Bikes and War Walkers, two decently efficient gun platforms without the core keyword, and both of which could be a good way to lay down more shuriken fire or bring more bright lances to the table. Vipers are really quite cheap indeed, don't actually have a too bad defensive profile for the cost, and their shuriken catapults underslung can be really quite dangerous as well, never mind their actual heavy weapon. They're also insanely fast, so should be quite good for getting lines of sight where you need them. Warwalkers on the other hand are a bit more flexible, packing 2 different heavy weapons of your choice, so you could spec them for anti-tank with 2 bright lances if you wanted. They're also at least reasonably tough with toughness 6 and a 5+ invul save too. +4 deployment options could be an interesting thing for getting an alpha strike, or maybe redeploying with Phantasm. The Guardian Defenders are perhaps the best damage dealing troops choice, though I still think at 9 points per model they are going to be a little bit more niche. In general, I feel like a lot of lists are just going to go for the minimum investment of rangers, and then focus more points on heavy weapons and the elites of the army. The new profile for the Shuriken Catapult is a good, just generally dangerous weapon with 18-inch range. It can easily be amped up in all sorts of ways to make it more lethal, particularly things like Doom and Jinx are great for the profile, and you could theoretically have them jumping out of the webway to unleash their damage if you wanted to. If you feel like you've got enough rangers for utility and basic objective holding, then maybe having a squad of 10 of these guys isn't the worst. Could be okay for skirmishing with enemies in the midfield, hopefully bullying off their own troops' choices, before being at least somewhat hard to kill in cover with their 4+ armor, at least a little bit more so than some of the other choices in the Codex. Next we come to the Falcon Grav Tank, who I think could easily have been a tier 1 choice. I was a bit on the fence about this guy. Basically the Grav Tank is really quite a nice gun platform in the first place with a pulse laser plus some heavy weapons, but also combines that ability with being a mini drop pod, being able to swoop down turn 1 with Cloud Strike and deliver a bunch of powerful warriors where they're needed, perhaps to either score the midfield or just deal damage to the enemy. Quite a nice combination of generalist firepower guns and unit delivery. I can certainly see people taking Falcons for a bit of a mixed role threat. Fire Prisms are maybe a tiny bit less exciting, I think. A kind of reasonable anti-tank damage platform, with the potential for the absolutely huge strike of Linked Fire, where you take 2 Fire Prisms along, and then both of them combine fire for a couple of command points for a big damage shot that just blasts straight through invuls. Against some armies that might still not be the biggest deal in the world, but if the opponent does have one seriously meaty threat shielded with very good invul saves, cutting straight through that with a focused blast of Prism Fire could give you a crazy swing in the game. You could potentially even have these guys firing and fading to stay safe while doing so, which could be a seriously irritating threat. All this does require a fair amount of investment in points and command points though. I feel like a lot of people are going to choose other things over this potential combo. Next we have the Corsair Void Scarred. I'd rank these towards the bottom of tier 2, I maybe could have ranked them in tier 3, but I do find them kind of interesting, just literally because they're basically an infantry squad that can also bring a mini psyker in their midst. You could put these in really big units, but I'd be more tempted to use them as a min-sized squad, and then buy in their Wayfinder upgrade, Then you've got a unit that can either deal a few rifle shots or a fair flurry of power sword attacks, and also cast a psychic power from Fate or Fortune, maybe the one just to sit there farming command points. It seems for 5 models plus a psyker to hold down the backfield objective, sitting around farming command points really isn't the worst. They could even flex it out for a bit of smite if they do get attacked by enemy at deep strikers or something. Next we have the Shining Spears, which I'd rank towards the upper end of tier 2. Again, I could have happily ranked these as a tier 1 unit. Shining Spears have an absolutely crazy threat range with decent shooting and melee power. They put out a lot of ranged fire with the shurikens and the laser lance before backing that up with yet more attacks in combat. What's more, they do this after having moved a crazy distance, so have an enormous threat range. And I do quite like the Kane's Lance X-Arc upgrade. That's the one that gives your opponent a chance to fight last. Perhaps their main disadvantage is that they're really quite fragile for the points cost. Despite a -1 to hit, they are still only 2 wound 3+ save models for a big 35 points. When the opponent gets to counter-attack them, they're going to go down pretty quickly. Probably not one to overinvest, but certainly very dangerous. Even a small unit could tear apart a good chunk of enemy before they get killed. Next we've got Wraith Blades, maybe one of the toughest core units that you can layer a whole load of buffs on. You can have some seriously meaty squads of these if you want to, maybe a good 400 points or so. And if you do want to just create a really tough unit going forward, then they could be a reasonable choice. Potentially have them stomp up the board with a toughness 6, -1 damage, and fortune for a 5+ feel no pain. And even have a 4+ invul save as well thanks to those shields. Quite nice to have a potential powerful anvil unit available to the Eldar. A lot of their units just tend to melt quite quickly to being exposed. So hopefully a fairly big investment of these could hold down one objective against all comers. They're certainly a great choice for the various different melee buffs you have available as well. A lot of the Warlock powers work really well on those axes. Finally for tier 2, I've chosen to rank really quite a lot of the HQs here. I don't think there's really anything wrong with any of these, but I'm just not sure that they're quite on the same level of units like Farseers or Phoenix Lord Baharoth. First up we've got the Autarchs. Certainly not a bad supporting HQ at all, just maybe not quite as great value as the Farseers in my opinion. Their rerolls for core units are usually going to be useful. I quite like the way that the version on foot can take a Banshee mask to help out with a bit of fights last, supporting your Auspex in combat, and you can make them generally quite dangerous in melee as well, with a few relic or warlord trait upgrades. The Skyrunner one with the lance, I'd be really quite tempted to take that relic bike Sunstorm. You've then got a really useful and quite threatening unit. A crazy 20-inch movement with Obsec is basically great just by itself, never mind that you can follow that down with a whole bunch of laser lance attacks, as well as a small flurry of shuriken fire. Otherwise we have the Spirit Seer, a kind of fine caster, probably good if you're using lots of Wraith units, but not so great if not. Iriol, the Cursed Prince of Iandan, does similar things to Autarchs with a few special rules and advantages and disadvantages, kind of handy if you want to make strategic reserve use in particular. And finally I'd choose to rank the majority of the Phoenix Lords here. Generally as a rule I'd say they're a little bit pricey for what they do. They all have okay damage outputs and defense with that 3 wound thing, and they make their own Aspect Warriors objectives secured, which can be quite handy depending on what you're using. They do all cost a fair whack of points for this kind of ability though. I feel like Baroth of the Swooping Hawks is kind of on another level compared with most of them, but in particular Janezar and Karandras I think are great picks as well. Objective secured on their aspects doesn't hurt. Janezar's got a long threat range and some very nice melee debuffs, and Karandras brings some very nice general purpose melee to the fight, the chance for a fair bunch of mortal wounds that you can make easier with Strands of Fate, and also all of that while being able to set up in the midfield. Finally though, let's get into the top tier units, the units that I think are going to be strongest in the Eldar Codex and are going to see a lot of play in competitive lists. First up we've got the Rangers, who as I mentioned a few times already, I think are probably the best troops choice in the Codex at the moment, though I do think that the Eldar troops in general just aren't enormously strong. You are likely to want at least some troops though, objective secured does help, and for 65 points getting 4 positions, obsec, and a little bit of useful sniper damage doesn't hurt. Having some Rangers about would allow you to punch in a mortal wound on a hard target with Strands of Fate. I think just in general having a few units of them about is going to be pretty handy for most Craftworld lists. They can do the boring stuff and maybe a bit of the dying, while hopefully the more elite and fancy Eldar get to work on the enemy. Next up we have the Farseers and Eldrad Ulthuan. Just in general for the Eldar, the Farseers have almost always been one of the cores of the army, and I don't think that that's set to change anytime soon really. Their psychic powers are just fantastic value, Guide for rerolling hits, Doom for rerolling wounds, Executioner and Smite for a bunch of mortal wounds, and they can also even farm command points and things, give you the option to lay down an Eldritch Storm if the enemy does decide to castle up too much, and even help you out manipulating the Strands of Fate table, which doesn't hurt either. Skyrunner ones also could be quite useful for jumping onto objectives and things, and having psychers about that can move fast is pretty handy for things like psychic actions and secondaries. If you do happen to be playing Ulthwé, I think that Eldred Ulthrun's a perfectly reasonable pick, basically more powers and cast more reliably, kind of hard to go wrong. Perhaps just about equally interesting though are the Warlocks. Again, you can get some serious value here, 40 points for a really good spell, or potentially 65 points if you want a bit more flexibility with the Skyrunner. I think Protect or Jinx is generally going to be the top pick for them, but just about every other Warlock spell that you can take really is useful. This can also be another way of making your opponent fight last, which they won't enjoy. Again, a Warlock Skyrunner could be a really interesting choice for doing psychic actions. I'm quite pleased that it seems that Games Workshop have managed to get Dire Avengers to be fairly threatening, despite moving into the elite slot. With 3 shots at AP-2 and the Shuriken rule, they can be just a general purpose hoover, stacking just fairly impressive amounts of mass damage on the enemy, and perhaps being one of the better units to combine with things like Guide and Doom. They can pick up Obsec if they want, they can fire while doing actions, which makes them great for missions, and they can make some very solid uses of some of the custom Craftworld attributes. Hail of Doom is amazing with them, that's the auto wounding on 6's Shuriken one, and also mobile fighters for jumping out of wave serpents and getting yet more damage there. They do require a bit of investment to make work though, but I think they're one of the units that takes the buffs the best. Speaking of which, I do think that the Wave Serpent remains a generally good way of delivering units into battle. It kicks out a bit of firepower, either with Shuriken cannons or Bright Lances, and the Serpent Shield makes it a bit more annoying to take out than you might expect, only being wounded on 4s and a 5+ invul. I'd probably rank it a bit more towards the bottom of tier 1 though. Maybe a solid unit a bit more because of the very good stuff that it delivers, as opposed to being hugely strong in its own right. Transports just do tend to have a good synergy with Eldar. They do have a whole ton of choices for very fragile but very dangerous infantry. Speaking of which, we come to the Howling Banshees, Kane's shouty power sword girls, who Games Workshop really do seem to have put big effort into actually trying to make work this edition. They're still hampered by very low toughness, but at least when they hit, they do hit hard. They've got a whole flurry of strength 4 attacks with +1 to wound. The enemy can't overwatch against them, they can advance and charge, they make the enemy fight last when they charge in, and the Exarch in particular can get very scary indeed, getting +1 damage on their attacks, either with an Executioner or with those mirror swords. Particularly with the +1 to wound, it just stacks them up into a very threatening unit that's going to be able to take out a lot of things. A big squad should be able to threaten most things in the game, even very heavy vehicles, just through sheer weight of attacks. Bonus points as well if they get anything like Guide or Doom off, or potentially even some of the Warlock melee buffing powers. They really don't like being struck back though, they're just very fragile for the cost, even at a native -1 to hit. Next we have the Striking Scorpions, a forward deployment chainsword unit, who again have the potential for a serious amount of melee threat, partly through weight of strength 5 AP-1 attacks, but also just through the amount of mortal wounds they can potentially kick out with their Mandiblasters. Again, they particularly love Doom and Jinx for the low AP plus rerolls on those mortal wound chances. With forward deployment plus Phantasm, they can be really quite a nice charge threat. I'd be very tempted by an Exarch with the Biting Blade and Crushing Blow. Lots of attacks at damage 2 and auto wounding is kind of hard to go too far wrong with. Otherwise, they can just be an alternative to Rangers for contesting the midfield early. Next up we have the very disturbing Phoenix Lord Baharoth, a ridiculously hard to catch, annoying threat that you can just afford to throw towards the enemy, usually deal off a whole bunch of damage, and then just happily retreat to safety every turn before your opponent can strike back. His shooting is good enough at strength 6, AP-2, damage 2 and 4 shots. That alone should kill a Space Marine or 2 each turn, and he backs that up with a whole flurry of damage 2 melee attacks at strength 5. Again, very good at chipping away at elite infantry, or should hopefully have a good chance of ending a character. He does have some slightly game-breaking redeploying abilities though, as he can basically just redeploy him anywhere on the table after he either chooses to battle focus or after he's attacked in combat, so theoretically if you did choose to fight with him first each turn, you could potentially be jumping him forward a massive 14 inches, shooting something, charging something else, he gets to do all that damage, then redeploy somewhere safe back in your lines, all ready to do it again the next turn with that massive movement of his. Unless you either play really gung-ho with him, or the opponent can do something very clever to take him out, there's a good chance he's going to last the entire game long. where hopefully he should be able to make easily enough kills to make himself worth it, and put a lot of enemies to the sword or the las blaster. He'd be a great fun unit to use, probably not the most fun to be playing against though. Next up we've got support weapons, the Eldar artillery, where I think that 2 of their guns are particularly good. Shadow Weavers kick out a whole load of AP-2 shots, always good to have a few attacks that can hit just anywhere on the table. These will be particularly good against fragile 1-wound infantry, like for example other Eldar. They seem particularly good in Ulthway as well, where for 1 CP you can have them hitting on 2s. The other standout choice I think are the D cannons, 65 points for D3 shots at strength 12, AP- loads and damage D6 plus 2. They are only very short range at 24 inches, but they do ignore line of sight, and they're a very threatening area denial tool, which might make your opponent think twice about putting units in range. For the points cost, they just hit spectacularly hard. I think it's really going to be a terrible choice to take a couple of units of those along, just to really punish anyone for setting foot into your side of the board. As a direct competitor to the Shadow Weavers, we have the Night Spinner. These seem very popular indeed, and a lot of competitive lists do already seem to be packing 2 of these. They're fast-moving grav tanks with ignores line of sight monofilament weapons, a whole bunch of shots at strength 7, AP-2 and damage 2. It's really quite dangerous for a barrage weapon that can hit anything on the table. Seems to be particularly strong for clearing out 2-wound infantry like marines, sheltering on objectives. Finally, we've got a few fast attack choices to round up. First up, the Windrider jet bikes, a fast-moving, cheap and powerful unit with some really quite good damage for the cost. I think 20 points for these is really nice just with shuriken catapults alone. They've got a crazy threat range, and kind of similar to twice the damage output of a standard Space Marine Intercessor who cost the same points. Their toughness is even okay as well, at toughness 4, 2 wounds and a 3+ save. They seem like a particularly good unit for bullying enemy troops, and potentially you could have a big squad of 6 of them doing things like retrieving Nachman data, maybe with Will of Azayan cast on them to allow them to still shoot, and they're very nice with certain buffs as well, things like other Farseer spells, the Ulthway stratagem, or the Hail of Doom custom Craftworld attribute. Next up we've got Warp Spiders, who for their cost put out a really nasty amount of strength 6 AP-2 damage 1 fire. It seems very popular to take the Surprise Assault Exarch power on them. That's going to give them all D6 plus 1 shots. Usually with the second Death Spinner on the Exarch, that's going to be around about 25 strength 6 AP-2 shots. That will be capable of blasting a whole load of medium infantry straight off the board. The Spider's Bite Exarch relic is also really nice. It actually makes them into a pretty reasonable melee threat unit as well, giving them a damage 2 power weapon hidden in there. So they could certainly justify charging some weaker targets. If they manage to survive on the board once they're down, their jump shoot jump shenanigans could be really annoying as well. 2d6-inch battle focus, or maybe running away when charging. It's just going to make them a bit more of a pain to deal with than most Eldar. Finally, last but not least, we have the Swooping Hawks. They basically do very similar tricks to Baharoth, laying down a volley of anti-infantry las blaster shots and jumping off to anywhere on the table. Again, if you're playing fairly conservatively with them, it should be very hard to engage unless your opponent's got barrage weapons or things that move very, very fast to get a line of sight. With all of those jump mechanics and being able to move so fast, they're a really nice utility unit to have around. Hopefully do a few turns of damage dealing with impunity, and then later game they could think about committing themselves, jumping onto an objective at a key point, or maybe making a break for the enemy table quarter to do an action like retrieve data. So despite having their fairly high price tag for their cost, I think they bring some great utility to a list. So anyway, plenty of horrendous Eldar tricks there. I do quite like the new Aeldari Codex overall. It feels like it's got quite a lot of tricks going, but a lot of the units do have genuine weaknesses in being able to be gunned down quite quickly if and when they're exposed. I look forward to hearing your thoughts on the tier list as always. Let me know down in the comments which units have been particularly working out for you on the table, or which ones have you happened to be on the receiving end of. If you've enjoyed the video, feel free to subscribe to Auspex Tactics, where I'll certainly keep the regular 40k videos coming, with new ones out just about every day. I'm sure we'll have plenty more for the Eldar over the next few weeks. Finally, if you have been enjoying all the videos on the channel, I would just like to mention that Auspex Tactics does have a Patreon page, which you can find down in the video description below. Channel patrons do get a fair few advantages, seeing certain videos early, regular votes to see what sort of things come next for the channel, and automatic entry into the regular prize giveaways with the chance to win some really big model kits each month. If any of that sounds good to you, or you'd just like to help support, the link is down in the video description. In any case, a massive thank you for listening, and I'll hope to see you guys next time.